Hello, please join me, accompany me in taking refuge and generating bodhicitta.
Sanje chedan soje chonam la chanchu pardo dane chamsu che dage jinsu jibe sunam chendro la penchira sanje dro bar sho Sanje chedan soje chonam la chanchu pardo dane chamsu che dage jinsu jibe sunam chendro la penchira sanje dro par sho sanje chedan soje chonam la chanchu pardo dane chamsu che dage jinsu jibe sunam che ro lai penchira sanje ro bar sho sanje chedan soje chonam la chanchu pardo dane chamsu che dage jinsu jibe sunam che ro lai penchira sanje ro bar sho semje tamje dewa tan dewe jo tan dembar churje dongar tan dongar che jo tan chawar churje dongar mebe dewa tamba tan mindra war churje Nyeren chadan tan charve tan nyom chenpo la nebar churje Semje tamje dewa tan dewe jo tan dembar churje dongar tan dongar je jo tan chawar churje dongar mebe dewa tamba tan mindra war churje Nyeren chadan tan charve tan nyom chenpo la nebar churje semje tamje dewa tan dewe joda dongar dan dongar je jodan chawar churje dongar mebe dewa tamba tan mendra war churje Nyeren chadan tan charve tan nyom chenpo la nebar churje Chomden den jambe yang lai chan cai lo kange lo zhen zhen nye zhen zhen nye tara nam da ram sar ve chi nye tuen gun chi shen si ni je to gar le bam Kanda si be zhen zhen ma ri mun tum dong ar chi sir ve zho co gun la pu ji tar zi yan la zhu ju yang den song 诸德切着牛摩尼龙雷杰加着着子切马里门斯东尔牛古吉尼君子扎着呢。Dune tajen saju tarsun yundene lezo gerse tuvu ko chura chudan chuni jent dalu munsren jambe yang la yendu zeden chuji chenra vizri chi dalu temo mumba ramsaran Gada denju shunlu toba ye lo zhu bo be nang wa zar du sur na sam ju me shira par chen ma chi min ga nam ke ngu ni so so rang ri yi shi ju yur wa tu sum ger we yum la chan ca lo Dige dage toba du jina jum den de jabu kaba jagu pongbu rila gelong gen gen dun chenpo dang chanju senpe gen dun chenpo dang tab che do shu de te ye se jum den de samo na wa shi che we chu je nam rang che ting yen zan la nyom bar shu so yang te ye se chanju senpa senpa chenpo pa pa chen re se wang ju shiram che pa ru do chenpa samyo che ba ni la nam bar ta shing pongpo nga bo te da jang rang xin che tong ba nam bar ta o ten de sang je je tu sa dang den ba shi ri bu Chanchu samba samba chenpo papa chenre se wangchu lan di ge chen he so rikje pom mo kang la la shiram che paro do chenpa samyo cheba cheba de ba de chedra la para cha di ge chen he ba tang Chanchu samba samba chenpo papa chenre se wangchu ge tsadang damba sharan do de po lan di ge chen he so shari po rikje pom mo kang la la shiram che paro do chenpa samyo cheba cheba de ba de da nambra tawra cha de Pombong abo teta chang rangshin che tongpa nambra yang tabra jiso tao su tongpa o tongpa ni su 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 le tongpa ni shen ma yen tongpa ni le chang su shen ma yen no ten shen do tsorwa tang du she tang du je tang nambra sheba nam tongpa o che re bo teta rwe na che tam che tongpa ni de tsenye me pa ma che pa ma ga pa chima me pa chima tang chawa me pa kangwa me pa o che re bo teta rwe na tongpa ni la su me tsorwa me du she me du je na me nambra sheba me mi me na wa me na me che me li me yi me su me dra me tre me ro me Rikja me che me do mi ge kam me ba ni yi je kam me yi je nambra she be kam je par do ya me do marik ba se ba me ba ne ga shi me ga she se be par do ya me do te shen do dong har wa tang kun jong wa tang go ba tang la mi yi she me to ba me ma do ba ya me do Chere bo dadar we na chen chu samba nam to ba me be chere sheram che par do chen ba la ting jin ne de sem la je ba me be tra ba me de chin je lo le shin do de ne nyang yen le de be tar chen do tu sum do nambra shu be sang je tham ji chang sheram che par do chen ba la de ne la na me ba yang da bra zo chen chu do ngam bra zo bra sang je so dadar we na sheram che par do chen be nga ri ba chen be nga la na me be nga min nyam ba da nyam be nga dung ra tam je rab do she bra che be nga min zu be na dem bra she bra cha de sheram che par do chen be nga ne ba Teyata om gade para sam gade mbunde so a sheriba chanju samba chamber teta shirab che paro do chamba samola labra chao teni chumden de tingin ze teli shinde chanju samba chambo pawa chinre ze onchola leso shi jawa chine leso rikje bo te shino rikje bo te shinde chidar chuje damba te shindo shirab che paro do chamba samola chebra chade te shin shaba nam chanji su yirangu chumden de che de ge che katsa ne satan damba sharando de bodang chanju samba chinre se oncho ta Bangwa chinre se oncho ta tam che dan dembe korda da da la da me da lama yin dan chizar che bi jidin yirang de chumden de che somba la ngambara to te ya ta om gade parang gade parasam gade mbodi soha de
The weather's much better today. Yesterday, we looked at the 12 links of dependent arising, interdependent arising. We focused on the importance of understanding and seeing the relevance to our own personal experience, specifically in terms of the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's diagnosis of suffering. We generally designated this concerning the existential problematics that we face, according to Buddhism. And then once we have understood this point, then the following point, a very important point to understand, is, of course, the origin of suffering. This understanding will allow us to be able to apply practice. There's not a kind of practice that we can do blindly without knowing what we are doing or why we're doing it. Of course, it's easy to identify as Buddhist, to identify with various aspects of practice, to carry them out, to do them, without knowing why, or without understanding the purpose of these practices. Here's a concrete example. We sometimes hear about Buddha's teachings that cover the vehicle, the common vehicle, the Shravaka vehicle. Sometimes we also call it the lesser vehicle, the great vehicle, the adamantine vehicle, the Vajrayana, and within the Vajrayana, maybe you've heard of various methods, such as Sabanagrama, Kerim, Tsogrim, also maybe Mahamudra, Tsogchen, and naturally, these are presented as each being greater than the last, each more profound. And sometimes, due to ambition or pride, I don't know exactly, we always want to have the most ultimate, the most supreme, the extremely superior teachings. We want to have these teachings. And perhaps we hear about a master who's coming, who is giving an empowerment on Vajrayana that will introduce us to the Vajrayana, and we want to go, but we struggle to actually participate. We think that we've received the empowerment, and then afterward we practice a sadhana, but it may be that somehow we haven't quite really, in reality, managed to apply these practices. We haven't really understood the goal of practice. We haven't really become aware or recognized the problem with our own existence and the origin of this. These remedies exist because of this. All of these practices exist in relation to this. But in our confusion, maybe with our fears, our desires, our wish to progress, which might also be a bit mixed with the imperatives of the ego, we might somehow contaminate our practice with our own misunderstanding. We might carry out a practice, a sadhana, such as the sadhana of Avalokiteshvara, Trinlay, which is very common. Many masters have recommended this practice. The first masters of our lineage who introduced the teachings of our lineage in the West, such as the 16th Karmapa, Venerable Kalu Rinpoche, also Jigme Rinpoche today, Shama Rinpoche. They taught the practice of Chinrezi according to Tangtong Galpo's tradition, and they recommend practicing it every day. So some people there's the idea that there is a being, a deity called Avalokiteshvara, who's going to procure a certain well-being for us. And in a way, this is in fact a theistic approach. So then what motivates our practice? Well, maybe we want to improve our family situation or have more success in life. Maybe practice is carried out with a perspective concerning what we call the 8 worldly preoccupations, or the 8 worldly dharmas. There are 4 preoccupations that are what we seek out, that which we wish to obtain, and 4 preoccupations concerning what we wish to avoid, what we don't want to have. What we wish to have, of course, are pleasure, gains, praise, fame. And what we fear are their opposites: pain, loss, to not be respected, to be spoken badly of, and then, of course, infamy or ignominy. In general, all of our activities, all activities of the world, if we look around us, all of our worldly activities are motivated by these preoccupations that we find generally, that we commonly pursue. It's possible that we may not be able to go beyond this because we haven't seen this point of suffering. If we don't understand suffering, then worldly preoccupations are perfectly legitimate preoccupations. But if we understand dukkha, then we can see that being preoccupied with all this is in vain. There's nothing in the pursuit of these 4 preoccupations that can lead to truly obtaining, truly acquiring anything that can lead to real progress. And then, when this is the case, if we see this, then there's disinterest. If we practice, for example, if we devote ourselves to Trinlay practice, motivated by worldly preoccupations, then it's not even really a Buddhist practice. Even if, in terms of the form, the transmission, it's a Buddhist practice. But we're not practicing it correctly. We're practicing it with a view, a perspective concerning the worldly preoccupations. We see it as a means to obtain praise and gain. And this goes, in fact, in the same direction as our worldly preoccupations. In other words, we don't see this practice as a means to access what is beyond suffering, but simply as a means to improve our condition, our current condition, and to create another condition, what we imagine to be a good condition. Might be, I would like to have this or that. I don't need to describe it. I think you all know. That's one way, for example, that we can have no expectations of practice concerning this lifetime. You may think Trinlay practice is a positive, virtuous practice, and then I'll have a happy rebirth in samsara. In short, this is a general approach of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is not necessarily for this lifetime, It's not necessarily concerning worldly preoccupations, but rather to dissipate our fears or worries concerning death, or concerning our next life or what comes after death. And here again, if this is our motivation, then we are not engaging with practice in a way that is truly Buddhist. In this sense, it becomes, again, a kind of theistic practice. We're relying on the grace and the protection of the great Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara so that he can help us obtain a happy future rebirth. There's not real disinterest for conditioned existence. There's always some kind of attachment for existence that is present in this sense. We can understand a certain way, okay, suffering as it was explained yesterday, and we can see that this is a condition in this lifetime, or even if it's a more pleasant condition in another lifetime. These are both conditioned existence, and due to this they are impermanent, and therefore they are marked by disappointment, and therefore they are suffering by nature. That there's no conditioned existence that's really worth pursuing, because they only result in disappointment, and therefore it is necessary to turn away from these conditions. This is what we call Nyingjung in Tibetan, sometimes translated as renunciation. The true meaning is complete disinterest for samsara and true orientation to go beyond this, to go toward enlightenment. And at this moment, when we truly see this, then this is when we truly begin what we call the lesser vehicle, often called the lesser vehicle, also the common vehicle. This is when we can say that we begin to practice Buddhism, a practice that is oriented towards enlightenment. So an understanding of suffering is very important, because practice is for eliminating suffering. We need to understand the origin of suffering, and by remedying the origin of suffering, also on the basis of this understanding, we see that all other sentient beings are in the same situation as we are. And then real compassion toward all arises. Then our practice is not cultivated only for ourselves, for our own liberation, but simply as a means to also be able to help all other sentient beings. If, on the basis of generating bodhicitta, we accomplish a practice such as that of Avalokiteshvara, then this becomes a real practice of the great vehicle. So if you have, yes or no, really generated bodhicitta, so it's not so much the practice itself, in terms of the framework, the structure, the recitations, or our idea of belonging, etc., of a name, this or that. That means that we're on this vehicle or not. It depends on our own understanding. And our own, perhaps we could say, maturity, the maturity of our understanding, how we orient ourselves, and how we practice in this sense. So on the basis of bodhicitta, if we use the methods of sambhanakrama, utpattikrama to transform our grasping, and our afflictions, then this becomes a practice that is truly of the Vajrayana. And then our wisdom and our understanding of reality, the more that our understanding is precise, and the closer we get to practicing the great vehicle. If we understand the teachings of Madhyamaka, and there's no grasping of self and other, if we see the insubstantial nature, then this is a practice that corresponds to an understanding that has been brought to its conclusion. For example, that of the Madhyamaka approach, the middle way. And then instructions will allow us to discern the original nature of mind. If we are able to discern it and then practice it, then we begin to approach the teachings that are considered the most superior. This is why I'm taking the liberty of perhaps being a bit repetitive, insisting on this point, the understanding of suffering. It's not just a theory that, okay, I've heard it once and then you stock it away and forget about it. We really need to understand and become aware of this. We need to reflect and think about, where does suffering come from? Is it random? Is the cause something external? Does suffering appear from nothing? If it is an outer cause, then is it a substantial cause or not? The various analyses that we brought up yesterday are important to, in the end, see that no, it's not something that is without cause or something that has an outer cause, like a substantial entity. The causes and conditions may be within us. And then what is this? What are these causes and conditions? Then by analyzing the 12 links of dependent arising, we can somehow discern the process of birth and rebirth in samsara, and the elements, if I may say, mental, connected with mind, that allow for birth and rebirth and perpetuation of suffering. So, in this sense, yesterday we discussed the idea of ignorance. This is an essential point. If we cannot discern ignorance, if we don't understand ignorance, then we won't know how to become free from it. It's possible that we might just cultivate another form of ignorance. So it's very important to understand what we mean by ignorance. First, we saw that our present experience is conditioned. And this conditioning depends on multiple factors. It is co-production that is conditioned, that depends on multiple factors. Nothing appears, nothing manifests without being dependent arising. All things that are present due to dependent arising. This is also true from my own experience and the elements that bring about this moment of experience, this life in general. the elements of dependent arising are, above all, our willful actions based on the afflictions. We emphasize the afflictions because afflictions are what, in short, produce negative actions. There are positive actions that create or condition, that lead to happy conditions, nevertheless still conditioned. For example, all actions related to nonviolence, kindness, generosity, all of these actions produce experiences that are happy experiences. But, of course, this remains marked by conditioning. It's not happy in the ultimate sense of the term. In the end, it will bring about disappointment, but it's better than suffering and pain of rebirth in the lower realms, for example. The poisons are what, in short, are the source of pain, particularly the affliction of hate, aversion. This one is the most destructive, that most directly brings about mental and physical pain and suffering, rebirths in lower existences. So it's very important for a practitioner to protect oneself from these afflictions. And if we cannot, of course, prevent ourselves from our habitual tendencies, having cultivated hatred over such a long time, then at least when the circumstances come together, for example, when we are confronted with a violent situation, for example, concretely, if somebody insults us or hits us, spontaneously anger arises within us. We can't necessarily prevent this. This occurs because of our tendencies. But we can do our best to prevent ourselves, to restrain ourselves from carrying out negative actions based on this poison by sticking to ethical discipline. The first exercise of a practitioner is to adopt an ethical discipline. And by ethical discipline, or thanks to ethical discipline, when someone insults us, then we don't insult them back. If someone hits us, then we don't hit them back. If someone makes fun of us, takes advantage of us, then we don't, in return, mock others, take advantage of others. This discipline, of course, anger, these things, they might arise, but not verbally or physically engaging in acts of violence. This is an example of ethical discipline. And then, in this way, we can't necessarily prevent the affliction itself. We don't know how to dissipate the afflictions, but at the very least, we prevent these afflictions from harming us fully. We prevent the most harmful consequences from arising. So long as the predisposition for these afflictions to arise is present within the current of our being, then we are never sure to be free from the most negative consequences. We may we may come to act based on these afflictions. And so it's very important to dissipate or eliminate from the root afflictions and their capacity to manifest. So what does this depend on? What determines this? What do the afflictions depend on? Hate, for example, is connected with desire attachment. For example, we can break down the poisons to the three most general: hatred, desire attachment, and confusion. Tucha, shija, timu, sum in Tibetan. The three poisons. So why does anger arise? Why is there desire attachment? What do you think? It's connected with self-grasping. If there is no self-grasping, then there's no hatred, there's no desire, there's no attachment. Self-grasping is what we looked at yesterday, an aspect of ignorance. It is the manifest aspect, if I may say, of ignorance. Ignorance in terms of an affliction. We looked at various points concerning this yesterday. Cherishing ourself. I prefer myself above all else. I cherish myself. And this relies on the belief in the existence of the self, of me. And this we presuppose it, we imagine it. It doesn't necessarily mean that we adhere to some kind of philosophical doctrine that affirms the self. There are philosophical doctrines that affirm the existence of a self as a substantial entity or a divine entity. But in short, we take this undeniable experience of life, and from it we deduce or we interpret it in a way that doesn't correspond with its reality. Because there is experience, we assume that there is someone who is experiencing and something else that's being experienced, and that these two things are distinct, that the subject that is experiencing is one, and that this one is the same, that it's permanent. So whether we are a human being, an animal, an insect, we have this feeling of self. And that manifests in the efforts that we make to protect ourselves. This isn't necessarily something that occurs on a conceptual level, something elaborated, self exists because of this and that, a philosophical doctrine. No, this tendance manifests in these philosophical doctrines. This attachment to the self is so strong, you'd say our disposition to believing in the self is so powerful that naturally doctrines that affirm the self seem completely natural and logical to us because it confirms our predisposition, our preconception. When somebody says, yes, there is a self, it's an eternal entity, substantial being, and that feels right to us. This is reflected in language, in grammar. It's implicit in all that we do. This notion of self, my body, my mind, as if the me, the self, is separate from the body and the mind. So when someone says a self is something independent and separate from body and mind that eternally exists, this corresponds to our preconceived notion. And when there are doctrines that teach us this, then we go along with it because this is our intuition. On the other hand, the Buddhist teaching is completely counterintuitive. It proposes to see, via analysis, that our intuition is unfounded. And because it is unfounded, then we can say it is ignorance. Ignorance can be understood in different ways. One way to understand it is misunderstanding or mistaken understanding. This understanding means not only an absence of knowledge, but a mistaken understanding, mistaken idea. To take something that does not exist to be existing, to be mistaken. We may look at someone and it's John, but we might think, oh, it's Paul. So this is a mistaken understanding or mistaken conclusion. So in this sense, we are mistaken concerning reality. We're grasping something that doesn't have a correspondence in reality. We grasp something that doesn't exist and we assume that it exists. This is also connected with this idea of self. There are a certain number of other ideas associated, notably, for example, the idea of mine, that which belongs to myself. This is also a mistaken conclusion. Not only do I have the feeling that I exist, that myself exists, that it is one and permanent, but on top of this, there is an attachment to certain things that generally things that we're attracted to, that we appreciate. We want to appropriate them for ourselves, and so we say that they are mine. This is mine. It's my seat. It's my name. It's my glass. My table. Property, this notion of appropriation, taking things for ourselves, relies on the notion of a self. Appropriation is just grasping. It's not something that exists in reality. We can see that it's just a convention, a conventional idea. And then, associated with this, there are still other mistaken conclusions that are part of our ignorance. We grasp a self where there is no self. We grasp mine where there is no belonging. We also grasp permanence where there is no permanence. For example, I think this is the same glass that I drank from yesterday. This is the same seat that I sat on yesterday. It's the same table. You're the same people. It's the same place. My intuition, the way I interpret reality is that there's no difference, that it's the same. If something changes, then it's accidental in a way. Things don't change in and of themselves. We think of things as being permanent. They stay the same. They stay themselves. This is what we call grasping permanence. This is also our ignorance. Ignorance in the sense of mistaken understanding or mistaken conclusions. We mistake what is impermanent to be permanent. Yesterday we looked at this analysis of a self a little bit in the sense that we cannot find something that is one and permanent in all of the elements that make up our person, but also we cannot find something outside of our person that could be the self, and so we don't find the self. We can see that in this sense the self is non-existent. We falsely believe in the existence of something that does not exist. This is mistaken understanding. Another mistaken understanding, we are mistaken in thinking that things are permanent that are impermanent. The notion of impermanence simply observing reality as it is. We can ourselves observe what we call coarse impermanence, apparent impermanence, obvious impermanence. This is, for example, the wrinkles on our face, the white hair that we have now. Erosion. He's looking for the word in French. Aging. Not obsolescence. Weathered, decayed. Weathered and decayed. The weathering and decaying of all the phenomena around us. We can see this. We can see the changing seasons. We can see these coarse changes, coarse impermanence. We can see that things weather, but we might think that things have weathered or aged because we use them too much, and if we use them yet less, then they would be less weathered. We think that things change due to the interaction between phenomena, but not that phenomena themselves naturally weather. The reality is that every element, every phenomenon is conditioned, and due to this, it is impermanent. Why do things change? This is a question that we can legitimately ask. Why is there impermanence and not permanence? Impermanence occurs or is present because all things are composed, made up of constituents. All phenomena that are manifest due to dependent arising or via dependent arising. Things manifest codependently. Nothing manifests on its own. And this aspect, that is this composite aspect, makes it that there is impermanence. Things change. So here, once again, we can see our mistaken understanding. We are often mistaken. All of the decisions that we make are based on this mistaken understanding. We make all of our decisions for the self, for an illusion in the end. We make a lot of choices based on our belief in permanence, the permanence of things. And of course, our misunderstanding is also connected we are mistaken in thinking that things are happy, source of well-being, that are in fact disappointment. So I'm coming back to this point, dukkha, not having carried out this diagnosis that the Buddha invites us to make in the First Noble Truth. There are many things that we pursue related to worldly preoccupations, success, pleasure. We think that we will be able to attain something, but we are only pursuing disappointment. In the name of well-being, we cultivate the causes for disappointment. Our objective, our pursuit is well-being, but we mistake our goal. We have not understood, we have not realized that this condition that we are aiming for, that we associate with well-being, is in fact of the nature of suffering. In reality, we're like a moth who throws itself into the flame. This is a mistaken understanding. Mistaken understanding, confusing suffering for well-being, confusing the absence of self with a self, confusing impermanence with permanence, confusing ugliness for beauty. Another example that's given. This is often taught in the context of the first understanding of ignorance. This idea, ordinarily, we look in the mirror, we find ourselves beautiful or handsome, we look at other people, we find them attractive, beautiful, but in reality, we're just made of flesh and blood. It's rather frightening. Skeleton, entrails, blood, pus, hair, everything that comes out of our body is nauseating. Saliva, earwax, snot, excrement, urine. There's nothing precious about a body. As soon as it dies, quickly, let's burn it, get rid of it. But we think it's the most beautiful thing. Some texts say we attach to sacks of disgustingness thinking that they are pure. I translated it today by confusing ugliness for beauty, but we could also translate it as confusing the impure for what is pure. This is often the case. When I touch a glass and I drink from it, I will drink from it again. I don't think that now that I've touched it with my lips, I've soiled it. But if someone else stood up and drank from this glass, I would be less inclined to drink from it. I would think that they've dirtied my glass. They put their microbes in it. I don't want to drink from it anymore. So this is, again, the illusion that we call taking the impure for the pure, when in reality, I've dirtied it just as much as another person. So these are some examples of what we call ignorance, afflictive ignorance. Do you have some questions concerning this morning's teaching? So, coming back to what you just said concerning the Vajrayana, how would I say it? In certain samayas, there's this idea of not having any judgments concerning beautiful or ugly, concerning offerings or what we encounter, to not label things if it's possible. So Rinpoche says, okay, to comment on this, well, this is sort of the point that I was coming to. I'm trying to get there progressively, if I may. There are different levels of ignorance. This is ignorance on the first level, we might say. There's self-cherishing, things that we take to be pure when they're not in reality, if we look. Here it's simply on the basis of our misunderstanding. There's an identification that is mistaken. We are shedding light on our cognitive biases concerning how we identify things. We don't identify the reality of the body that's made of flesh and blood. We think of it as something beautiful. We haven't identified the reality of phenomena that is impermanent. We think of them as being permanent. We have not identified suffering. We take the situations that we pursue based on the worldly preoccupations and that take up all of our energy and efforts. We take these things that are only disappointment in the end to be well-being. And we have also wrongly identified ourselves. We think of ourselves as being a self, I, me, permanent, one. But we can't find any correspondence to this in reality. So in this sense, we can speak of ignorance. And then, wisdom. We could ask the question, so what do we understand by wisdom? Is this identifying impermanence? Is it having this thought, oh, that's impermanent? Oh, that's just a body. It's ugly. There's nothing attractive there. Oh, there's no self. This is a form of wisdom, but we could go even further. This is where probably, in the context of the Vajrayana, just to discuss this point of ugliness or impurity, the impure is also an idea. It's grasping. And then this brings us to the notion of insubstantiality, impermanence, as well as impure, as well as on-self. These things also don't have any substantiality. This corrects another level of ignorance. I might think I identify, I create a conception that is that corresponds with reality, and then due to having this conception, this is seeing impermanence, conceiving of impermanence, conceptualizing impermanence, and this corresponds with reality. But it's not quite wisdom yet. We're still remaining in a form of reification. The person with the microphone gets to choose who asks the next question. Thank you. On top of it, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to express this question, but I'll try. In the name of well-being, we cultivate the causes for disappointment. This question entered into insubstantiality. What I'm wondering about, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to say it. Martin Luther King. I think about this example. In the name of well-being, we cultivate the causes for disappointment. Is there misunderstanding in naming? Is there misunderstanding in naming? If I enter into insubstantiality, where is ethic in terms of responsibility if I'm entering into insubstantiality, if self doesn't exist? Rinpoche says, I think I got it. I hope I understood right. Understood your question. We might answer it simply. The first point you said, cultivating suffering in the name of well-being. This is misunderstanding or a mistaken conclusion. What we need to understand here is that what we identify a condition, I don't know, fame, for example, wealth, power. We think, oh, I'd be happy. I will have attained great success if I become number one in the world, the best, the most respected, if I'm the richest or the most powerful, or among the most powerful, among the richest, or even we might be separate from comparisons with others, might just be, I want to be rich enough, respected enough in my community, in my society. There is an identification of a certain condition, a certain situation in life that we would like, that we'd like to bring about, that we'd like to have. Then, if we look from the point of view of the teaching on suffering, we see that regardless of the situation we manage to obtain in this life or even in a future life, it's still impermanent. It won't last. And there are a lot of problems. Everything involves problems. Wealth involves problems, power involves problems, fame involves problems, having a lot of people who love you involves problems, you have to put up with them. Everything is a problem. Everything comes with difficulties. There's nothing that is really happy in this situation because it is a conditioned situation. So now, concerning your question about emptiness, I think that was what you were getting to. Emptiness understanding emptiness is, in a certain way, accessing the absence of all confusion. It's beyond all of this coarse confusion. This is a much more subtle level. But it's important not to understand the idea of realizing emptiness as being in some kind of state of nothingness. There's no more thoughts. We can't communicate anymore. That's not what emptiness is. It's also not a kind of obliteration of consciousness. It's simply that there is no longer any misunderstanding concerning reality, and the afflictions no longer arise, but perception can be present. It doesn't exclude the abilities of the mind. It only excludes misunderstanding. So concerning your question about ethical responsibility, this kind of question, ethical responsibility is not excluded by emptiness. Emptiness indeed allows for true ethical responsibility because there is this understanding of emptiness. This realization in our mind allows us to be free from all confusion, all affliction. And this comprehension is manifest in all of the qualities like generosity, love, compassion, patience, the 6 paramitas. The 6 paramitas are spontaneously manifest in the realization of emptiness, free from all confusion. Confusion is what prevents the expression of these qualities. There was somebody else in the back first. Hello, Rinpoche. Hello. I'm wondering about a question related to what you said earlier, related to grasping certain objects as belonging to the self, my glass, my table. So to play devil's advocate a bit, I wonder about this belonging versus one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism, which is not stealing, not taking others' belongings. So how do these two notions work together? Notably, I'm thinking about this question concerning preserving ecosystems and the way that human beings have appropriated resources. There are two levels of interpretation, we could say. The first understanding of belonging is that it's a convention, but it's a convention that often in experience of it for the one who's living it doesn't appear as a convention. When it happens, it really is mine. I worked so hard, I sweat to be able to buy myself this. If someone doesn't recognize that it's mine, I'm gonna fight for it, I'm gonna kill for it. This is, how can you say it? This idea of mine is associated with attachment, desire, attachment, etc. And somehow, since everyone expresses themselves in this way, then we created the state that guarantees property so that people don't fight over everything. You can see with animals, when something appears, they try to get it for themselves, they fight, they kill each other. Human beings, we have laws, so when somebody else has something nicer than him, then, you know, he accepts it. We accept our own part. As these are conventions, but they are somehow, this is in terms of appearances, in a sense, but also there's this aspect of desire attachment that brings us to this notion of belonging to me. And this, all of this aspect of ethical discipline, which says not to take that which is not given, this is respecting others. In other words, someone, other people need to eat. They need to fulfill their needs. There are things that they have appropriated for themselves that they think of as being their own, whether it's a human or an animal. Animals also have this notion of property, of belonging. They have their place. Predators mark their territory. Bees have their hive. All beings have this feeling of self and things belonging to themselves. And so what they appropriate as being theirs is related to what allows them to survive, to fulfill their needs. So this ethical statement is to respect this. The purpose of this ethical discipline is to respect this. The Buddhist teaching says that self and property don't have an objective reality. That doesn't give us a license to take what others think is theirs. It's not like, well, in reality, it doesn't belong to you, so I can take it. You are exercising illusion yourself by appropriating it. If it's not theirs, it can't be yours either. Substantially. If there is no him, there is no you. You don't exist, I'll kill you. It's important not to understand things this way. These phenomena this cognitive error makes us suffer. We are dying, but our attachment to everything that is ours, we can't let go of it. We can't give anything away. This attachment to self and mine, it brings about greed and other problems. Seeing that all phenomena are impermanent, that we no matter how much we grasp them, we can't hang on to them. This can help us to nurture qualities of generosity, but also, to start out, understanding others' illusion and being able to respect their confusion. They are attached to that. This is the source of their suffering. This is their problem. Taking their things isn't helping them, it's adding to their problem. So these things are not at all in contradiction. The idea of mind being an illusion is not at all in contradiction with the ethical discipline of not taking others' things. And then you had a question about ecology, something related to ecology. The questioner says, well, with this perspective concerning common goods, shared property, how do we respect collective property? Rinpoche replies, well, indeed, because it's important to go beyond this notion of self and be able to think of us. And then in this sense, we need to be able to feed ourselves, we need to be able to survive, we need certain things. Our planet, even if the population has doubled or tripled, the planet is abundant enough to feed everyone. But resources cannot satisfy greed. Greed is endless. In this way, it's necessary to understand it in terms of the fact that there are resources. If there are resources, then we can use them to fulfill our own needs, survival. But taking more than that is excluding others from having access. If we want to fulfill our desire, never. Desire is insatiable. It's like drinking salt water to satisfy our thirst. The more we drink, the more thirsty we are. This is the nature of desire. And the more that we have, the more that we want. And desire can never be quenched. This is why it's important to cultivate contentment. And we can find true satisfaction in contentment. It's up to us to decide, if I have this or that, it's enough. I can survive. And this contentment is true wealth. I think it's in the Dharmapada. The Buddha says the greatest thing we can ever possess is our health. There is nothing more precious in a certain way for ourselves than good health. We cannot possess anything more precious than good health. And the greatest wealth that we can possess is contentment, satisfaction. Wealth is not so much in terms of the number of things we have. We can have so many things, but be completely unsatisfied. And in that sense, we are poor, even if we have a lot of things. So if we can cultivate contentment and satisfaction, then we can respect common wealth goods, property, common resources, not take advantage of resources, and we ourselves will be able to be truly serene and happy. Oh, I've gone beyond our session for this morning. Please excuse me. We'll take a break now until 10 minutes before noon.
Pamche seba ni tone ni pe ranam pamche ni chega na che balap trubai sibe chole rowan rower show. O sanje che dan so je chonaim lai chang ju pardo dane jam so che da kim yin so ji be so nam che ro lai pen che sanje ro pa sho sanje che dan so je chonaim lai chang ju pardo dane jam so che da ki jin so ji be so nam che ro lai pen che sanje ro pa sho sanje che dan so je chonaim lai chang ju pardo dane jam su che da ki jin so ji be so nam che ro lai pen che sanje ro pa sho.
Here we don't have much time, so I propose that we continue with our discussion if you have more questions. I have a question that's a bit personal to me anyway. You said earlier that the Buddhist teaching was counterintuitive, and we see this every day in society. Rinpoche says, what do we observe? The questioner says that in society it seems that everything goes against these teachings. And we talked about impermanence, that we're in the illusion of impermanence, and we reinforce it. We do everything we can to maintain this illusion of impermanence. We see it in terms of aging. I was reading the other day that they're practically going to create a vaccine against aging, and then we were talking about water and commonly shared resources. So my question is, between practice and engagement, perhaps civic engagement, Buddhist practice is personal. It's individual. I mean, I guess individual comes back to the self, but I don't know how else to explain it. However, in the society that we live, we try to be concerned about shared resources. I don't know, personally, what degree or how do we engage? How do we be in accordance with these teachings and in accordance with this vision of society? I think that, in general, the teachings, the Buddhist teachings, are to be used, in fact, this is how it's suggested, in the texts themselves. In other words, we need to look at the Dharma as a remedy. That means here, I'm a sick person, I'm ill in a sense. I see the Dharma as something that can help me to heal myself. In this sense, Dharma is first to be used for oneself. I need to realize that I am in ignorance, that I'm in confusion, and to look for how I can myself develop wisdom. I can't impose it on others. I can't say to others, you are ignorant, realize wisdom. They are in confusion. They can't immediately access this. So, through applying the teaching to our own mind, to the stream of our own being for ourselves, cultivating it ourselves, then we can become an example and then share our knowledge and help others to realize the benefits of Buddhism. This connects with another question that was asked this morning concerning property. It's not by going and saying to somebody else, me and mine don't exist, so you're confused, that's not yours. You're mistaken, you're wrong. Of course, we can't act this way. We need to understand confusion and illusion for others. If we understand it for ourselves, and then we'll see how this confusion profoundly affects us. And if we truly see this, then we'll be more concerned about others' confusion and their difficulties. If for ourselves we manage to vanquish, overcome our attachment to the self, to what is ours, then what will the impact of this be on our lives and on society? Well, our afflictions will diminish and we will be less harmful. We'll be able to help more. We'll be able to truly express generosity and kindness. And in this way, we will be able to incite or bring about these qualities in others. So first, we try ourselves to live, or how could we say, to personify through our conduct the ideas of the teaching, to become an example that will inspire and bring about these qualities in others. If we show kindness and generosity, then naturally, spontaneously, others will express kindness and generosity. We can't go say to them, your property, it doesn't exist, give it to me. Their attachment will be even greater. They'll feel attacked. And by bringing about attachment and aversion, whereas if we give, if we show our own application of the Dharma within our own stream of our own being, then we'll bring about generosity and kindness within others. In this way, we can help beings. We can't help beings despite themselves. Their becoming depends on their own actions. We can't act for them in their stead. But that also doesn't mean that we don't have any influence. If we ourselves act on our own becoming in accordance with the Dharma, if we cultivate primarily virtue, if we don't harm others, then we produce for ourselves well-being and favorable conditions. But this can also be useful and serve others by affecting them and influencing them in a favorable way. This gentleman here, he's been waiting a long time. He's very patient. I'm trying to ask my question in French. It's very clear when things change. But why are we still convinced that there is something, or there must exist something that is permanent. What is this contradiction? This is a contradiction. Maybe a part of the question or a part of the answer, which it says you can ask in English, because our speech is an essential condition. This is an essential condition of our speech. Is there is something, for example, if we say, be careful of cars, we understand. We know what the word car means. Normally, a car is always something else. But is this necessary? Is it necessary to have concepts to learn this concept that things exist in a permanent form? And then after we learn that things exist in a permanent way, then we can learn that it's not true. Rinpoche says, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. So now in English, you can hear it in the room.
Nevertheless, we are convinced that there must exist things which we do not live like that. We always think things are there and exist. And I have the idea that this exists, that this is the case because our language is working like this and our concepts are working like this. It's kind of way we orient in the relative reality. Therefore, it is necessary that we first have to learn all these concepts, and then we have to learn during the Dharma or due to the Dharma that all these concepts are mistaken. Or maybe you just answer the question: why do we think things are permanent? But they are.
So first let me summarize the question in French, but here in English. Why do we think that things are permanent when they're not? And yes, that was it, right? And the rest of the question was related to the fact that, is it due to language and our concepts? It's an interesting question. Why do we grasp the self? Why do we grasp permanence? It's simply a misunderstanding, a mistaken conclusion. We can see that in terms of language, we might ask the question, is it because of language that we grasp impermanence? Or does language reflect the grasping of impermanence that preceded language? We might ask this question. For example, children, babies, animals, they don't express language other than in a very rudimentary way. Do they express impermanence? Language, as I see it, does not precede conception. Language expresses a way that we approach or conceive of. Language follows thought. It comes after thought. Language does not produce or does not manifest first before thoughts, and then thoughts appear. Rather, it's the opposite. Because we have these thoughts and these concepts, then a corresponding language with everything that language implies, substance, how could we say it? Name, substance. All of these things are implied in language. Without getting into the details, the important thing is, where does this cognitive bias, this ignorance, this confusion, these mistaken conclusions that we maintain, perpetuate? This is the most important question. Where does this come from? The origin, if I may, is simply misunderstanding. There isn't any other origin. It is just not being conscious of reality, the original reality of mind, of emptiness, not discerning it. And this comes with being conscious of experience. This is a trickier question that requires more analysis. There are different answers that can be given concerning this subject, with more or less detailed possibilities. This simply comes from the fact that we have not seen, and we mistake reality for something that is not reality. We can walk into a room and we see what is in fact a rope, but we think that it's a snake. What causes this mistaken perspective? It's just ourselves. We've wrongly interpreted this. We're confused. We falsely attribute a quality that is not present in reality. This is a possibility. Go ahead. There are 2 questions over there. I have a first question that is connected to your answer. Can we find explanations that allow us to understand why mistaken understanding, why is misunderstanding the origin? We always get down to this. Okay, mistaken understanding or misunderstanding, but why? The second question is, what does a life without afflictions actually look like? Life without afflictions. The first question I answered a bit. Maybe we'll come back to this subject this afternoon to analyze this point in greater detail. The why is because it's possible, simply. There isn't a reason apart from the fact that we make the mistake. that we are mistaken. It's self-explanatory in a certain way. If there were another reason, another thing that brought about mistaken understanding, what would it be? It's just confusion. There isn't another entity that created misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, the condition of misunderstanding is mind's, the basic condition of mind, but primary consciousness. This is the condition for mistaken understanding to be present. That this primary consciousness has not recognized itself for what it is. This is ignorance. So, there you go. And then, what is it like when we are completely free from the afflictions? That means we are also free from ignorance. So this is what is enlightenment. Enlightenment is not some kind of paradise or something conditioned. When we ask how is something, then of course we're describing the conditions. Enlightenment is free from all conditions. From any artifice, from any illusion. When someone asked the Buddha to describe enlightenment, I believe there was an image that the Buddha gave. Can't remember the quotation word for word, but the general sense was, it's as if you were to ask a mute person to describe the taste of honey to someone who has never tasted honey. It's inexpressible. As soon as we express something, what we express is necessarily something conditioned. It implies a certain state, something constructed. Enlightenment is something that is perfectly free, that is connected with the qualities of primary consciousness, that is originally, primordially free, naturally free. And this is present for all sentient beings, but it is unrecognized. And due to the fact that it is unrecognized, beings have not been able to cultivate it or fully realize it. This isn't creating it, but rather revealing it. Practice is simply surmounting all of the afflictions, and specifically what is the basis of all the afflictions: confusion, ignorance. Enlightenment is, if we want to describe it, primordial consciousness free from all confusion. It's not something very different from mind as it is now. Simply, this present mind doesn't see its own reality. It is in confusion. Enlightenment is what is free from all this. But we can't look for it like something that's elsewhere or some kind of construction. It's connected with reality in the most subtle, original sense of the continuum of our minds. Can I ask a question that's a bit more connected with what you said yesterday than today? Sure, go ahead. It's in relation to emptiness. What's the difference between emptiness and interdependence? Rinpoche says, there is no difference. There is no difference between emptiness and dependent arising. As we saw, what is manifest due to dependent arising, what is dependent arising, has no substance. When we normally think of causality, we think about it in terms of something linear that supposes a causal basis that is independent, based on which the effect that follows is manifest. In this sense, ordinarily, the effect depends on the cause, but the cause does not depend on the effect. The effect arises from the cause, but the cause does not arise from the effect. But dependent arising, as we briefly explained it yesterday, means that the effect depends as much on the cause as the cause depends on the effect. This means that they are co-produced, they are codependent. If they are codependent, then this indeed means that there is no element that exists independent from another. If there is no independent element, then there is no substance, there is no being in and of itself. And emptiness is the absence of being in and of itself, quite simply. So emptiness in this sense is not a nothingness or a nothing. We think that reality is manifest because it has a basis, because it is substantially established. We think, for example, if we're theistic, that the world exists because it was created by an eternal entity that we call God, who is independent and who produced the world. If we're rationalist, physicalist, and modern, we'll say the world exists because physical matter, atoms, their components, their infinitely small components exist. All of the things that we perceive it exists because there is something that created it. And this something that created it exists independently. All of this is the effect of these primary elements, or an event that occurred, like the Big Bang. Something that truly happened. Something that really exists as an individual entity. In short, all of our explanations somehow cannot go beyond our cognitive preconceptions of substance, reification. We can't seem to surpass reification, presupposing that there is a being in and of itself, something distinct that produced something else. That cause and effect are different, that the effect occurs based on the cause, and the cause occurs independently of the effect. And most essentially, all theories of causality affirm this, that the effect depends on the cause, and effects occur based on cause. But this is the difference between dependent arising. The causes and the effects are mutually dependent. They mutually produce each other. And this is indeed the case. To give an example, we could an example I gave another time earlier, previously, is the example of a bomb. Let's take a bomb, and we'll say, this is the cause of an explosion. This is the cause that will produce an explosion that will destroy something, right? But the destruction does not produce the bomb. That's how we think of it. We don't see how it could produce the bomb. But this is a cognitive bias. There is a cognitive bias present. In other words, we anticipate because we know about a certain part of the causal field, and so we look at one part of the causal field, but it's not the whole causal field of the explosion, and we anticipate its possibility, saying this is the cause. But at the moment when we see the bomb, it is not yet a cause, because the effect has not yet happened. This is a cognitive bias based on which we look at part of the causal field. It only becomes a cause when all of the parts of the causal field are manifest. For example, we have a bomb, okay, but we also need the presence of oxygen, the presence of an environment, lighting the bomb. And this collection of causal field, this whole that is the causal field, will create an explosion. But the explosion itself is what makes it that this causal field is a cause. Without the explosion, it couldn't be a cause. It's only a cause because there is an explosion. So, insofar as it is an effective causal field, it depends on the effect. Just as the effect depends on the causal field. They are mutually dependent. It is our perspective that separates them as two separate entities. One as a single entity that is cause, and something else different that is result. Because in their appearance, in manifestation, their appearance is different, but they are mutually dependent. The other cognitive error that we can make is to think that they are one. That the causal field and the effect are one and the same thing. And this is also wrong. It's not one. Cause and effect cannot be one. If they were one, they should have the same appearance, the same characteristics. A part of the causal field, oxygen, for example, the lighting of the fuse, all of this aspect of the causal field, each of these aspects taken separately cannot produce the explosion. It is the coming together of these specific things that results in the explosion. If it were one and the same thing, then we would be able to see the same things. If the explosion already existed in the bomb, then why would it need to explode? It's already exploded. It's not one and the same things, but they are also not two independent entities, separate from each other. They are not two entities in which one is the consequence that depends on the other, and the first is an independent element that exists without its consequence. They are codependent. They are mutually dependent on each other. They are co-produced. And this is indeed how all phenomena function. If reality is manifest, it is not because there is something substantial that establishes it. It is indeed because there is no substance. And our error is grasping and reifying substance where in fact we cannot find any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Di tamchi siba ni tone nyepe ranam pamchi chega naji balap truba yi sibe solen rowa sho. À tout à l'heure.
See you at 3.